Welcome everybody to another episode of Joshi's Ramblings. Today I'm going to be talking about issues that I have with the stat check elo system that they have in place and a couple of the ways that I hear people talking about it fairly often. If you have not watched any of these Joshi Rambling videos before, it's going to be a little rambly. That's kind of the comes along. I'm going to be doing this off the cuff and we'll go from there. But yeah, so I just want to spend some time talking about ELO. We'll do an introduction to it, and we'll talk about some of the things that make it really not intuitive for a lot of people to kind of understand. So, before I go too far, I do want to say StatCheck is great. I love StatCheck. I watch most of their podcasts, or listen to it. It's one of my favorite things to listen to, like as I'm driving to an event. It helps me get into the right state of mind. So they have multiple great podcasts that you should go check out. They do a ton of great work in the community, providing the metadata dashboard, which they update every couple of weeks, ELO rankings, which they update every couple of weeks. Lots of great coaches. If you want to learn about how to play the game from some of the best people in the world, go check out StatCheck. I really can't say enough good things about them. They are a fantastic community. All of the people that are involved are great in my few interactions I've had with them. I'm going to put a couple of links to their stuff down in the description. So do not think in any way, I don't hear anybody say, I hate StatCheck. I'm a big fan, but I think there's a lot of discussion that happens around ELO in particular that I think is not very helpful because people don't understand it very well and some of the things and the way that the system works in order to, and I'm going to try and clear some of those up as we go. Okay, so firstly, what is ELO? I refer to this fairly often in my meta updates. I generally use a 1600 cutoff of ELO for my good player breakpoint in terms of talking about teams list. So what is it? What is ELO? ELO is a number that you assign to a player in an attempt to quantify how good you are at the game. The only thing ELO cares about is whether or not you win the game or lose the game when you play. When you play up against someone and you win a game, you will gain ELO. You will increase your score. And if you lose, you will lose ELO. The big thing about ELO, though, is that it compares what your ELO is against your opponents before the game, and then if I have a bit higher ELO than you do, and I win, I'm not going to get as many points, and if you beat me and I have a higher ELO, you are going to gain more points. And then the reverse is true, of course, if I lose, I'm going to lose a lot of points, and if you lose, you're not going to lose nearly as many points. And by doing this over and over again, you continuously compare people with different ELOs. The more games you play, the more accurate it becomes. But that's basic. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's the simplest version of it. It's a number where we try to quantify how good you are at the game, and then we compare that every single time you play up against another person. For stat check purposes, the only games that count, the only games of record are singles games played at five round events or more, and I think the cutoff is 24 players. So it does have like a minimum threshold. Your RTTs don't count, your teams events don't count. It is only your GTs that you go to. Okay. This system and systems very similar to it are very common in competitive games. It is most famously used in chess, where FIDE or all the different federations in your local countries keep track of all the games that you play against other people in your area, and they will attempt to quantify how good you are. It's very common in board games like chess and Go. It's also very common in things like League of Legends, Dota, and Overwatch. However, a lot of video games in particular tend to put a fancy overlay on top of it. If you play League of Legends, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that I'm silver or I'm diamond, and that is an overlay. There is an ELO underneath it, but in order to help the situation feel a little bit better, they will put another system on top of it in order to disguise your ELO a little bit. One of the important things to think about is that the starting number in ELO is entirely arbitrary. It really does not matter. The biggest thing that you care about is you don't want people to go below 0. But even then, it doesn't really matter. StatCheck uses a starting point of 1500, and it is what it is, right? It's entirely arbitrary. You could have picked any number, but they picked 1500. Okay. So, ELO does have some unavoidable issues, especially in a Warhammer context. The first one, not all factions are created equal. If you were playing a couple of months ago and you were playing Death Guard, Imperial Knights or Chaos Knights, when they were super, super busted, you were winning games. You were probably winning games that you would not have won if you were not playing a super powerful faction. Elo assumes that isn't relevant. We only care about the strength of the two players. Okay, that's not something we can really take into account. The other one, missions, deployments, who goes first, these are not created equal either. Just like playing white or black in chess, the mission of the map that you play matters a lot for who wins the game. A matchup can be really good going first, and a matchup can be really bad going second. Or the other way around. It doesn't really matter. And this is unavoidable. I know there's lots of conversations over the years in like Valorant or League of Legends or any kind of game where they're like, "Oh, but I had a fantastic KDA this game. I went 15-1-4. Therefore, even though I lost the game, I should be gaining rating points." And it's like, no. The only thing that we can really take into account in real ways is winning. Other than that, there are always going to be ways to game it, because let's just say you're playing a bad matchup, right? As an example, like, what's a really bad matchup? GSC has been really good against Eldar for most of this edition. If GSC plays against Eldar, and as an arbitrary number, let's say GSC has a 70% win rate into Eldar, do we give like the Eldar like different odds? No. Well, I mean, we could, but then we have to do it for every faction, and then it becomes a real cluster of like trying to figure out all these different factors, and it frankly just makes more ways to game the system if the only thing, or if there's anything else other than only winning and losing. So it's kind of unavoidable. That is not going to be captured. If you are just playing your favorite faction, it happens to be bad, your elo will suffer because of it, but in the long term, in the long run, it should more or less even out. There's no really good answer, so that's why we only really care if you win or you lose. Okay, next, elo distributions are generally, or at least they should be, looking like a bell curve. This is, you take a look, I grabbed this. This is all the players who are currently on the elo sheet, with 36,764 players as of the time of recording. I used some fairly big buckets of like 50 elo, and so you can see that like there's a massive peak, but in general it is still more or less a bell curve. There are more players who are high elo, or right there. It's called the way that I've set it up. It's a left-tailed, so there are more people like on the left tail on the like 2,000 plus elo than there are below 1,200. I think there's like one player below 1,200 right now. But this is normal. This should be expected. There should be a clustering that you would expect around whatever the starting point is. This is basically always going to happen, simply because that's how skill works, right? Whatever the standard is, whatever the average player is, you're going to have people who are better than the average, you're going to have people who are worse than the average. But most players are going to be average plus or minus a bit, right? That's just how this works. Yeah, okay, moving on. One of the interesting things about elo to note is that there is a massive clustering of players around the starting elo. So this is just giving you kind of an idea. These are different percentiles. So the 99th percentile of players is that if you're 1733.2 elo or above, you are in the top 1% of players. Okay. Whereas the 50th percentile of players is 1497.3. It's slightly below the starting. But what that means is that 10% of all players on the elo ladder are between 1500.2 and 1497.3. In fact, 50% of all players on the ladder are between 1510.2 and 1483.0. This isn't super relevant here, but really important thing to note, if the elo ratings of two players are accurate, the higher rated player here is only expected to win like 53% of the time, or thereabouts. It's less than 55%. It's basically a draw, right? It is really close to like flip a coin. It doesn't really matter. 50% of players are between those two brackets. Okay, 80% of the player base is 1,500 plus or minus 50 points. Not super surprising, but I'll come back to this in a little bit in talking about why this is kind of a problem when we actually start talking about like what we can do about it in order to talk about it better. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about, one of the big issues with the stat check elo as it is currently implemented is there is a huge number of inactive players on the leaderboard. And this is something that we can avoid, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But here are some ways that I tried to get a lower bound on the number of players who are inactive. I took a look at the spreadsheet and I just did a search 2024. If you had 2024, which almost all of the pop ups in the Excel search were 2024 in the event name, the most recent event that they played in. Okay, of those, there were 3,055 players whose most recent event had 2024 in their event name. It might be a little bit lower, but one of the important things to think about here is that most events that you go to do not have the year of the event in the event name, right? There's all kinds of things. Like one of the funniest ones, like West of Scotland GT. I don't know when that was. That could have been a month ago. That could have been 3 years ago. But there are others, like the 2025 World Championships of Warhammer, which had like a ton of the top players on it. That one, we know when it was. And so players who went to the 2024 World Championships of Warhammer, they haven't played a GT in a year at this point, right? This goes even further back. In fact, of the 2024, 2023, and 2022, there are 6,000 players who have not played a GT in however long it's been. That means 16.5% of the current leaderboard is inactive. They have not played in at least a year, which is a lot. That's a lot of players on the leaderboard to be inactive. And so it generally means that a lot of the people that are on the leaderboard in general aren't playing. They're not updating their numbers. The next thing that I kind of want to talk about, before I move on, one of the important things that I didn't make a slide for, and I probably should have, is the concept of decay. So StatCheck a while back implemented a system of decay where if you do not play any games at a qualifying event, so 25 or 5 rounds or more, 24 players or more, if you don't play anything in 13 weeks, you decay. 20% of the difference between your current elo and 1500, the starting point, is wiped out. So if you don't play a game in 13 weeks and you start with an elo of 1600 and you lose 20% of that, when you come back, it'll be 1580. Okay? So really important thing here is someone who hasn't played since the World Championships of Warhammer 2024 has had at least 3 decay windows hit. That means so the first time is 20%, and then it's 20% of that, and then it's 20% of that. That means that I think it was 48.8. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's like about half of the difference between their elo in the World Championships of Warhammer and now has just been wiped out. It's just gone. Okay, so that's part of why we have the major clustering here, because anybody who was like 1600 is now like 1550. Right? Anybody who's 1550 is now like 1525. So they're constantly being smushed towards the center. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is the number of players on the board that just have not played games. Part of this, I don't know what percentage it is. Some percentage of this is a good thing. It is new players. It's players going to their first event, right? Every single event that we have, there's going to be someone who's going to their first GT. And that's great. I want to encourage a lot of these players to start playing a little bit more. However, one of the major things to think about is that of the like 36,000 players, I think, yeah, in the bottom right, like 36, almost 37,000 players, 22,000 of them have 11 or fewer games played total, right? And this system has been going for a couple of years. I think it started in like 2022, thereabouts. 22,000 players, or 60% of them, have played 2 events or fewer. 13,000 of them, or a little bit more than a third, have played 1 event or fewer. And a lot of these players are kind of in that middle. So below that in the table, there's a couple of other spots where it says middle half. These are only looking at players who are between the 25th and the 75th percentile in terms of what their current elo is. Of that middle half of players, so about 18,000 players, 14,000 of them have played 11 games or fewer. That's a little bit less than 40% of the total, and more than 3/4 of the middle half have only played 2 events or fewer. And then if you look at the who've only played one event or fewer, 9,000 or just under half of the players in that middle half have played one event or fewer. So there's a couple issues with this. One, like I said, new players, their elos are going to be basically meaningless. If you've played only one event, it doesn't really mean anything because the more games that you play, the more times the comparison of did you win, did you lose, who did you win, who did you lose against comes into play, and you get a much better sense of how strong a different player is over time by doing this. If you haven't played that many games, it's not super useful. Someone like TJ Lanigan, who is the player with the most games of record in the ladder at 315, his elo, very accurate, right? But somebody who's going to their first event, who's played one event, and maybe they went 3-2. It doesn't mean very much, right? Like they just happen to be like right in the middle. That they lose to like good players? Okay, maybe they didn't lose very many points. Or they beat bad players. It just hasn't had a lot of time to calibrate. But the big thing here is a lot of these players. If we know that 16 as a lower bound, 16% of players are inactive, and 60% of players are just like haven't played a lot of games, there's going to be a massive overlap of players who have not played very many games and not played in at least a year. So there's a lot of players where their elos are currently meaningless. They don't mean anything for anyone. Okay. The other really big thing to kind of think about is the ends of the bell curve play way more games. And this shouldn't be surprising to anybody based on the conversation that we've been having so far. The first part of it to think about is in order for someone to be like really high elo, you just need to play a lot of games, right? I don't know what the actual number is, excuse me, but if you get like an average of like 10 points per win against like the average field, and you want to get to 1600 elo, you need to win 10 more games than you lose. So that can be 10-0, or you can get 20 wins and 10 losses. So it's not super surprising that the ends of the bell curve play way more games than the people in the middle. But the big thing here is the top 10% of players, the 90th to 100th percentile of the 662, 403 player games total that we have listed in the StatCheck Elo spreadsheet, 211,234, or nearly a third of them, are played by 10% of players. Okay? They are overrepresented 3 times compared to what you would expect if it was evenly distributed. And that kind of goes back, right? The players who are not playing very much tend to not play very much. But the people who are playing a lot, the people who are at the top, the people who tend to be the best in a lot of ways, they're playing a ton. It shouldn't be super surprising. The one thing to keep in mind here is the numbers that we're showing here aren't necessarily recent, right? TJ Lanigan, I know, has been playing for a long time, and he's the person with the most games at 315. But someone like Wesley St. Hines, who fairly recently started playing GTs, I believe in the past, like, year or so, he's got like 100 games. I think it's like 95 games of record in there. So those are relatively recent, but that is the one downside of like looking at these. Yes, the people who've been playing for a long time, the people who have become good, are going to have more games. Okay. The other big thing about this is, and we'll get to this even further in a little bit, is the top 25% of players. So remember, anybody who has an elo of 1510 or higher is going to be in the top 25%, have played half. They've played half of the games, or player games, like one half of a game. They've played half of all the player games since elo started being taken into account. Whereas the middle 50% have only played 30% of those player games, right? 50% of players are only playing 30% of games. So a lot of the middle is just not very meaningful. It's inactive. They haven't played a lot of games. And they're honestly not super likely to play more games. Okay. The one other big thing that I want to talk about before we start talking about some of the further problems here and why it is difficult for a lot of people to follow is not all regions play a lot of singles. So the 2 regions that I know that are the most famous for this, where they're not playing a lot of singles events because they're mostly playing teams, are France and Australia. Both of them have really, really strong cultures for teams events, which are not included in ELO for good reason. Not going to get into the why in that today. But these players they still tend to play some GTs, but a lot of the really good players in France are just like they don't have an elo. A lot of them are playing under pseudonyms. A lot of them are playing under gamer tags. So a good example of that is there were 33 players at WCW who just didn't have an elo. They didn't have a number of they didn't have a number because of the going to GTs, and about half of them were French. This isn't a knock on the French players at all, but I know that French players in general, they play under aliases quite a bit, and they don't really care about singles in the same way that a lot of other regions do. So they end up being like really underrated. A really good example of this is Jean-Luc Guenin, who made Top Cut, had an ELO of 1545.4. That should be unthinkable for anybody who is actually that rating to actually make Top Cut at the WCW, because like a player, most of the people who made Top Cut were like 17 to 1800 plus ELO. Those players should be having like a 10% win rate against a lot of people who made Top Cut. But he made it, right? Another great example, Petit Aurelien, who showed up on a couple of streams, did very well. I believe he lost in the Shadow round, I think. Didn't have an ELO, right? He just doesn't have an ELO. He was not represented in the numbers. So that is one of the big things that we end up seeing at like major events or major international events when these players play up against each other. There is a great ELO transfer, especially to the French, because they are way better, and the Australians, because they are way better than a lot of their ELOs represent. Okay. It's a relatively minor point, but I do want to bring it up. All right. Why is all of this problematic? Okay. Stats are already not very intuitive. I'm going to go ahead and give a quick stats puzzle for people who are watching. One of my favorite questions to ask people when they're complaining about their dice is you have an attack, okay? This attack hits on a 2 and it wounds on a 2, and your opponent saves on a 6. What percentage of those are likely, or like what percentage of those are going to be a successful damage? Like how often are you going to do damage to the thing? Okay? A lot of people, like intuitively, when they think about stats and they think about dice, are going to be thinking it's about proportional, right? You know, anything but a 1 on a hit, like that's a 90%. Anything but a 1 on the wound, that's a 90%. But it's not. The way that you do this is you just multiply 5 times 5 times 5, and you divide it by 6 times 6 times 6, and it spits out, I think it's like 58%. If you said 60%, like just mentally, it's good enough, right? You're going to get a number that is about right. However, when we go back to this and we look at things like the percentile of ELO, it's not very meaningful. So a great example of this is the stat check peer versus peer. Okay, when they say peer versus peer, the idea is that the top quarter players are the good players and the bottom quarter players are the not good players, right? But that's not really how it works. It's not really giving you a good idea of what is actually going on with any of these factions. It's not giving you a good idea of how strong different players are. And so one of the first things that we look at here is that if you look at the top quartile of players, where you take a 75th percentile player or better and a 75th percentile player or better, and you make them play against each other, that represents 8,000, almost 8,100 of the 20,000 games that were played on this balanced data slate. I went back on the meta dashboard. I clicked on the last two, so everything since the data slate, including the 2 most recent codexes that came out. That's 40% of games. 40% of games are played between 2 top quartile players. Where if you look at the bottom quartile players, only 2,400 of them were played, or just under 12% of games. The other big thing that I want to point out here is the massive, massive ranges that those are talking about. The top quartile players represent an ELO range of 2,064.5. I might actually be wrong. I swear there's a couple 2,100s. Whatever. 2,064.5 to 1,510.2. That is an ELO difference of 554. Okay, so another brief aside here. A ELO prediction is that if I have if I have a 100-point better ELO than you do, if I'm 1,600 rated and you are 1,500 rated, ELO would predict that I'm going to win about 5 out of 8 times. I should have about a 60% win rate. This 500 plus elo difference means that the top player here that we're expecting, who I believe is Josh Roberts, is expected to have a 96% win rate against the lower rated player. That is ridiculous, right? These two players are not in the same they are not in the same league, right? This is not a useful comparison, okay? The other side of this is the bottom quartile represents an ELO range of 1483 to 1177.1, which is about a 300 ELO difference. I think this is, I didn't actually calculate it, but I think it's like a 75% win rate for the 1400 player. It's a huge difference. Like, these quartiles are not meaningful. They are so big. And the other major thing that we kind of go back is that the sample size is massively different. The sample size for the top quartile is nearly 4 times larger than the sample size for the bottom quartile. Okay. So with all this in mind, I do want to give a couple of things for you as you're looking at StatCheck Elo, as you're thinking about StatCheck Elo, as you're using the metadata dashboard in order to talk about how good things are, how strong a lot of things are. And I was reading a thread on Reddit where people were like, yeah, I use the top 50% of players in order to look at this. So the issue with that, as we've kind of established, is one, the top 50% is it's like half inactive, right? Most of the people in the middle quartile, or the 50 to 75th quartile, a lot of them are just inactive, like they're just not playing very much. And it's also a massive range, right? Like, legitimately, it is comparing people like Josh Roberts and Wesley St. Heinz and Folger Piles to the 50th percentile players. You are legitimately comparing like Tiger Woods to me, and I don't golf, right? Like, it's not fair. It's not useful. So here are some ways that you can like look at the metadata dashboard and actually come up with relatively meaningful data points that are going to be useful in your conversations. So for you, if you are trying to come up with data that is useful in terms of like, what are good players doing? What are good players expecting? You should be using 1600 ELO as your cutoff. Okay. Now, when you have that slider up on the metadata dashboard, it's not 50%, it's not 75%. You should be setting it to the 95th percentile. 95th percentile, the top 5% of players. Okay. And you should do this for both player faction, or like player ELO, and opponent ELO. So, a couple of things here. One, this represents, over this current data slate, 5,908 games. That's 28.9% of the total games played on the metadata dashboard, just under a third, a little bit more than a quarter, right? That's a really good sample size for like the number of games that are actually being played. And these players also represent 92% of event winners. 92% of people who win events are in this top 5 percentile. Okay, and this is what it looks like since the balanced data slate came out. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you can see like Eldar, still 57% win rate from top 5% players against other top 5% players. On the bottom, we have Gene Stealer Cults, 42% win rate by Gene Stealer Cults when they're playing other good players. Couple other interesting ones that I just kind of wanted to point out that caught my notice earlier. Guard, Astra Militarum, when good players are playing it, 51% win rate. And where is the other one? Admech, 52% win rate. It is very good, but there's clearly more going on underneath the hood than a lot of people are expecting. Everybody knows the best Admech players are having a lot of success. However, it seems that a lot of people still haven't figured out how to play Admech super well. Okay. But anyway, if you're trying to get good data, you actually need to restrict to a very small percentile of players by ELO, because the games that they play are a huge percentage of the total games played, and right, 5% of players are playing nearly 30% of games. Is like a 6 times multiplier. And it also gives you a fairly good idea of like where health actually is for the game. Okay, so if you're trying to figure out what good players are doing, this is what you should be looking at. The other big thing that I want to give, so some people are like, okay, cool, that's what the good players are doing. What do I want to do for the middle players? And a lot of people will look at, you want to look at the 25th to the 75th percentile. And that is also like not super good. Remember, the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile is like 1480 to like 1510. That is, it's 50% of players, but the player games that they are playing is not very many. If you go to I didn't actually look this up. I probably should have, but the 25th to the 75th is not going to be 50% of the games. It's going to be like 30. Yeah, it's going to be about 30% of the games. Like, you're not getting that many, and you're also getting a very narrow band where most games are just coin flips because, to be perfectly honest, the players are not very good. If you want to have a useful data on what middle of the road players look like, you should be using 1450 to 1600 as your cutoffs. This will give you the 25th percentile to the 95th percentile, right? That's going to be 70% of players, which is a little bit larger, but the percent of games is also going to be fairly close. You could cut this down to like 25th to like 90th or 25th to like 85th, but you need to go higher in 75th here, but the 25th to 95th is going to be 63.4% of games. 70% of the players playing 63% of the games, fairly close. This represents 8% of event winners, so you are still going to get a couple of good players here who are either underrated by ELO, and maybe they just haven't played particularly recently, so their ELO is underrepresented, or sometimes, a middle, like a above average player is still just going to have a really good run. Sometimes that'll happen as well. But what we can see here, a couple different things happen. One, Eldar, 55% win rate, not as high as amongst the top players. So clearly there's some skill expression going on. Guard, 53% win rate, very interesting. Higher than actually the good players because people at the higher levels have figured out how to play against Guard a little bit better. But other interesting things, Adeptus Mechanicus not doing well on the middle tables. 46% win rate over the most recent data slate. What was the other one I was looking at? Sisters. Sisters still 53%. But kind of like looking at this gives a much healthier idea of what the middle of the meta looks like. And this gives you a much more accurate idea. If you want to get really accurate with this of what top players, you probably want to go to 1700, which, where is that? Did I show it down here? No, but like 1700 is like the 98th percentile. It's going to be, like in here. Anyway, okay. So this is, if you are trying to come up with like better ways to talk about ELO, better ways to use ELO as a tool to understand what's going on in the game, you need to understand that the middle of the ELO, useless. It doesn't mean anything because people are decaying, people are not active, and they don't play as many games. If you want to know what's going on in the general world and you want to know what good players are doing, you need to go a lot higher than you think you do because the game becomes exponential. Right? I am currently like a 1770 ELO player. I'm in the top like 0.8% or something like that. If you want to like catch up to those players, you're going to need to like look at very small number of players because these players are playing tons of games. I am playing way more games than the average person. I have like 100 games of record. But like if you're trying to like catch up, you just need to look at like who is actually playing games and how are they doing. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about what StatCheck can do because with all the good things that they're doing, there are a couple of things in the way the metadata dashboard and ELO is presented that makes it not as useful for a lot of players. The first thing, so let's talk about it again. Inactive players represent a far too high of a percentage of the player base. So one of the big things here, people who have not played since 2024, people who have not played since 2023 or 2022, get them off the ladder. They're not useful. They are changing the way that the data is represented in the metadata metadata dashboard. We should get them off the ladder, or at least hide them in some way, because someone who is 1500 and hasn't played since 2022, where their elo has just decayed like 80% or whatever the number is, that doesn't mean anything. It's not useful. Nobody's getting anything useful from saying, "Oh, this guy, he's 1510, but he hasn't played since 2022," because that guy was like 1700 or 1800 the last time that they played, right? This is a guy who could very easily have like one LVO, or like would have gone far and potentially like made top cut at the WCW years ago. Get him off the ladder. It's not useful. It's not interesting to see, and it is really like, I don't know. It's not useful. It's actually detrimental to the way that we're talking about a lot of the elo. The other thing, and this is kind of like a me thing, but just in general, decay is incredibly powerful on the ladder in ways that I don't think is particularly healthy for people. So the first one, to be honest, I just think it should be removed. Like I think decay is not useful, especially for a game that does not get as many reps. Like decay in League of Legends, where it takes you like 40 minutes to play a game, and you can legitimately do it like after dinner. Like, you just like hop on, play a game, takes 40 minutes, and you update your score, or you update your elo there. 40k, like we take like 3 hours per game. We can't get that many games in, right? The highest, like TJ Lanigan, again, has played 315 games of record on the ladder. I played that many games of League of Legends per year in ranked alone, right? Like it is not the same. We cannot be having a more powerful effect on the elo than actually playing games. And the fact that decay is as powerful as it is, especially for people who have like had a kid. I know a couple of people who have just like missed it out. It's really, really powerful. So we should at least like double the decay, or and we should also make playing teams like reset the timer, because someone like Jean-Luc Guénin, I know he's playing in the Tier 1 leagues over in France. I know he's super active. The fact that he is now 15-4, or he was 1545 at the beginning of WCW, is ridiculous, right? Like, we know this guy is a whole lot better than that. We know he's better than that. And the fact that we are letting him decay as much as he is simply because he's not playing this style is actively harmful, I think, in the way that we actually talk about elo. Okay. The one other thing I would really encourage anybody on Stat Check who is watching this to do is use the numbers that we were kind of talking about. So, here, I don't give a crap what the top quartile does. Me and the bottom player in the top quartile are not the same caliber of player, right? We should not be having this conversation. Innes, Jeremy, you guys are not the same caliber of player as someone in the top quartile. Let's have, instead of the peer v peer versus be top 25, let's legitimately do it for top 5% of players. And then for the bottom quartile, I don't know. Realistically, I don't think knowing what the bottom quartile is doing is like that interesting. I think if you're trying to have like good discussions about like what people are doing, one of the axes should be top 5%, and the other one can be like, I don't know, like 40 to 70, 40 to 80, something like that. Whatever you think is like a reasonable snapshot of what the middle like half of games are. So you could probably tweak it a little bit. Like, what would the middle half of games be? It's probably legitimately like 30th percentile to like 80th percentile. And then we can get a much better perspective of like what the top quartile looks like versus what the average player looks like. And this is mostly just because the peer versus peer sample sizes that we're looking at, they're leading to bad conversations, is I think the biggest criticism I have here. Is it's not that the numbers you're presenting are dishonest, it's that the people who are reading them, like Jeremy and, oh god, Jeremy and Nathan, I know you guys know stats. This is your job, right? I know a lot of you guys, you've got your bachelor's or master's or PhDs or doctorates in stats, but most people don't. Most people don't know what these numbers mean, and it's leading to bad conversations that I think are making discourse worse. Yeah. With all that said, I do want to wrap this up on a positive note. I do want to come back and give once again a big shout out to StatCheck, Jeremy, Nathan, Innes, Anthony, and then all the guys on the other podcasts as well. You guys do great work in the community. I really appreciate what you guys do, and this video is not trying to tear down anything that you're doing at all. I think you guys are doing good work, and I think it could be even better with some relatively small changes. Elo has issues. It is not perfect. There is not a perfect system. I so much prefer it to ITC, but that's like a different talk entirely. But it's still the best rankings that we currently have available. So thank you for making them public. Thank you for helping that out. And hopefully this is worthwhile as a good discussion point to make things even better. Once again, if you are not familiar with StatCheck, please go check out their website. I will have links down in the description to their YouTube channel and to their website, so you can check out even more of this on your own. Anyway, this has been an episode of Joushi Rambling. I don't normally go this long, but I think it was a fun topic. I think it's interesting, and hopefully other people got a little bit of something out of this as well. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Joushi Rambling, and we'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.